how do you best discuss grief with your children? That's the question that we're going to address today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. Flourish-Meant is part of the Spark Media Network and can be heard on the Edify app. Today, I have with me Mark Gregston, and he has been working with teens for decades. He started as a youth director, and he was also an area director with Young Life. And then later he moved to Texas, and with his wife, Jan, he started a residential counseling center for struggling teens and their families in crisis. And he's here to talk to us today about how to talk with children and teenagers about grief. I am so glad that you're on the show today, Mark. I can't wait to dive into this issue.
I think it's a big issue, quite honestly. I think our kids are experiencing grief in a number of different ways. And oddly, the way that I've kind of come into this is not only seeing the impact of death of animals or death of a grandparent or somebody within somebody's family, or the fact that kids know kids who have committed suicide, or they hear of deaths somewhere now more than ever, that we need to spend a little bit of time helping them grieve through some of the issues that they face at a time that they probably struggle with it the most. And there's a part of me that says, we push a book, but in one sense, the book is really pushing toward conversations that we can have about loss and difficulty and hardship and grief with our preteens and our teens.
So when you were starting this residential counseling center for teens, did you find that teens were struggling with death in that period as well? Were you really ministering to them when they were suffering from losses? And not every loss is loss of life. Sometimes loss has to do with loss of innocence, loss of way of life, or a place where they lived, or a set of friends.
Yeah, I think kids experience loss in a number of different ways, and I think one of the issues that when a grandparent dies, usually a child is younger, and they're still thinking concretely, and so we give them a lot of abstract answers that they don't understand. They don't have a clue. They just know that grandpa is gone and somebody's buried in a cemetery somewhere. I'm not so sure how to deal with that. And we even have that opportunity when our kids have animals the same way. And so I think there's losses that way. And because we've been afraid of it, then I think what happens is we kind of just say, well, let's get another puppy, or let's just move on, or let's forget about that. And I go, you know what? We would be healthier if we help kids understand what's going on and not give them answers that really aren't appropriate. I mean, they're in a better place. Well, they are in a better place if they're in heaven, but that's not what that child feels in his struggle. He's in a worse place because he just lost somebody or something or some animal that's been so important to him. And we just kind of candy coat it a little bit. And let's say, let's move on. And I think that hurts kids. I was in Nashville recently, and we sat at a dinner, and there were 20 to 70-year-olds in the room, probably 15 of us. And somebody asked about this book, Where's Stitch? And I said, it's interesting. It's all over the death of a dog. Well, all of a sudden, everybody in that room had a commonality that everybody had lost a pet before. 2 or 3 people started crying as they shared their story about loss. And I really sat there and I thought, this is really about unresolved loss in their life. They never process it. And it was something that was so important to them that they feel like it just got kind of passed over. And I think it's important when we help kids with grief that we talk about those things, that we engage with them in such a way that it's something that it's okay to have loss. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to not feel right. It's okay to cry. It's okay to struggle through those things and remember the good things and why God brought that person or that animal into our life.
I'm hearing a lot that we are missing an important piece that used to be part of our culture in ancient times, and that is the ability to lament a loss. We are skipping over it, trying to make everybody get over it, get better, feel better, because adults have grown out of that into adults that don't know how to handle grief and don't know how to lament. And so they don't know how to help their children go through lament. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think lament is that state of of grief where we actually recognize the loss of something that's been very important in our life. And we get this idea that, well, if you have a relationship with Christ and your relationship with God is good, and you know that everybody's going to heaven, well, then get over it and you ought to be okay and life moves on. And I go, what we've just done is ignore the depth of loss that somebody has experienced. And the tendency, if we don't help them process it, then it will never be resolved. And they'll look to other things and people to fill that void. And they won't be able to because they haven't had that opportunity to grieve. And the amount of grief that somebody has, if they don't get depressed or overly anxious or, almost manic in one sense, it measures the depth of love that they had for something. You take something away that I don't care about, it's not that big of a deal. But you take something away from me that I care about deeply. Now I get a little bit bothered that you're giving me answers to something that are somewhat trite. And where I felt that, I had a dog that died, and I was doing some stuff with the Hallmark Channel, and one of the producers of the program said, "You need to write a children's book on this." And the whole point of it was, here's a dog that was living in our house. It's the lineage, the last dog of a lineage of 42 years. Had slept with us between my wife and I at our feet every night for 11 years. Was in the truck with me every day going to work, knew every kid that lives with us, and I live with 65 high school kids. Every time I recorded, that dog was in the studio right next to us. Everything I've done, that dog has been with me. And so all of a sudden she has a grand mal seizure, she's gone, and people start telling me, well, she went to doggy heaven. Well, she crossed the Rainbow Bridge. Well, she's in a special place. And that was so trite to me that I said, it's just like us to come up with all these answers rather than just leaving it for what it is, that it is a sense of loss and there are no answers to it. So the title of the book is Where's Stitch? And the answer is, I don't know where she is. I mean, I have no idea. She's right here in my heart. God gave her to us to teach us some things, and we had the opportunity to hold her about 30 seconds after she was born, and we held her as she passed into wherever she went when she left us, and we got a picture of life. And so when somebody says, well, you shouldn't grieve over an animal or go get a new puppy, I'm going, that's how we treat death of an animal. And for a young child that's a preteen, or even those teens that experience loss, it's not healthy to just run over it and say, let's go replace it real quick. It is so important to engage with that child and help them process the grieving patterns that they will go through, if you will, and let them cry and let them talk about that. And don't go out and get a new dog immediately. Give it a little bit of time and tell the child it's okay to not know the answer, that you don't have to know the answer to everything. And it's okay. It's okay to have difficulty with the loss of something. And to me, that is something wonderful. And it's a gift that we can give our kids when they've experienced loss in their life.
Shows that we actually value life when we mourn over the loss of life.
It really does. It really does. A good friend of mine just lost his son on Christmas Day to fentanyl overdose. He lost his other son 6 months prior. And he goes, don't tell me that everything's going to be okay, because it's not. Don't tell me that my son's in a better place, because we're not. And don't tell me that he's right there next to us, because I feel like he's a million miles away. And don't try to make me feel better about something that I'm mourning over. And I looked at him and I thought, he is responding in the most real way of loss in his life. And it's nothing that I can say that's going to pull him to any other place. He needs to go through this. He is mourning the loss. He's having that lament over the loss of something that I pray that he'll never get over, in one sense, that he will always remember the value of his sons, that he will always remember what important relationships they had with one another, and that there's a hole in his heart that will teach him how to love differently, engage differently, and have better relationships with those people that will come into his life in the future days.
I've always kind of thought that God never really intended for us to experience this. In the original setup in the Garden of Eden, we were supposed to not have to deal with death.
Yeah,
Death is part of brokenness. And
yeah.
so God grieves with us over every single death. It breaks his heart. And that's why Jesus wept during those times when he
Mhm.
was present in grief. Do we talk to children about it from that angle, that Jesus weeps with us in our grief so that they have time to experience his presence during that time of grief?
I think that kids, quite honestly, will pick up, that presence of God in their life because of the example that we set before them. I mean, just as the word became flesh and dwelt among us, I think with kids, that parents are to let the word become flesh in them. Out of the abundance of their heart, their mouths will speak. And they could be Christ to their kids as we emulate that relationship that we have. If we're to be to our kids who God is to us, then our mere presence will bring a spiritual flavor into what a child is feeling when they see that we mourn as well over the loss of an animal, and or we cry over the loss of an animal, and when they see that, they're given permission to do the same rather than hurry, let's bury this dog and get over it and move on. I mean, and that's the tendency. Let's go out and eat. And I can tell you, I mean, I've lost a lot of people in my life. When I'm grieving the loss of somebody, that's hardly the time that I want to eat food. I don't feel like eating at all, as a matter of fact. And we go, well, no, we got to make it a better situation. And I go, there's something about those cultures that grieve the loss that is a reflection of the wonderfulness of life. That is that it's a signature that they really have a concept of life, an appreciation of life, and it's measured by the way they respond when there is a loss of that, rather than making it feel good all the time.
Take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to talk about some specific ways that we can actually minister to our children
Mm.
during times of grief, and how we can prepare them to better understand friends who are grieving around them. So we'll take this quick break and we will be right back. Meet the Christian who married faith with true crime. All my true crime fans, this product is for you. I'd like to introduce you to Lori Morrison. Lori is a person of faith, a private investigator, and the producer of the award-winning podcast, The Unlovely Truth, where faith and true crime intersect. Lori and I would like to invite you to join the True Crime Mission Fields program, a life-changing opportunity exclusively joining Christians who have married faith and true crime. Featuring Chaplain Lori Prather, the products within the True Crime Mission Fields program allow you to connect your passions and skills as Christians with practical service opportunities within the world of true crime. You will begin to serve people in difficult circumstances and have a greater impact in this world than you ever imagined possible. Access your free report, Meet the Christian Who Married Faith with True Crime, and receive up to 70% off of any collection when you use the link in the show notes. And we're back with Mark Gregston talking about how to talk to our children about grief. Mark, what are some specific ways that we can respond better to kids and help kids respond better to their peers when there is a situation of loss, whether it's of a pet or an actual loved one that's a person in their lives? What are some things that we should do that are different from the way that we might have as our default response in culture?
Yeah. What a great question. And I think part of that is making sure that we just don't explain something away. I mean, for a young child to understand death, it's something that is one sense abstract. And in the spiritual world, where that spirit leaves the body and is gone, for them to understand that, it is very difficult. And so for me to try to take the opportunity and think that they're going to embrace that is wrong. And they are hurting. Now's not the time to talk about the next step. Now's the time to say, let's just talk about this. Tell me some good things. If they lose a dog, tell me some good things about Stitch. Tell me some things that you remember. what do you miss most about Stitch? Why does your heart hurt so much? If you had to put a word to what you're feeling, what would that word be? Well, quite honestly, most kids wouldn't know what that word is. And so that's where just the discussion and talking about it and visiting that over the next few weeks, not just saying, let's go get a new puppy and make them all happy again. What we do then is cover up the very opportunity that we have to deepen a relationship and give them the flavor of what a wonderful and valuable life can be. I mean, there's life in every animal. There's something about that for a child to embrace and realize that this dog is more than just a bag of chemical reactions, but it's actually a dog that they've attached with. So now that they've lost it, now let's talk about that and not be afraid. And sometimes some of the best things is just to hold your child and not say a word. I mean, that scripture that says that even a fool appears wise when he keeps his mouth shut. And sometimes it's just best to go visit the grave of a dog, or if you've had a dog cremated or an animal cremated and you bury it somewhere on your property, to go visit that and go plant some flowers around that grave, to honor them in some way, to put up a sign, to put up whatever we need to put up. You know, Stitch, my dog, has a little marker out in our yard. And nobody will ever see it. Nobody cares. But for me, it makes all the difference in the world. And it reminds me of God's goodness of giving us animals to teach us more about him. And I've said this a million times. If I could be half the person that my dog thinks I am, I'd be twice as good off. And there's just something about that the way that she treated me and listened to me and spent time with me, if I could do the same to other people, I'd be a much better man than I am.
A wonderful point that we can learn so much from all the animals and people in our lives, and we should value that. And I think we should value all of our feelings too. We tend to only value the good feelings. And in our culture and Western culture, we devalue all the negative feelings and want to stuff them and bury them and not let anybody experience them. And everybody also experiences emotion and grief in a different way. Can you talk about how we can give permission to children and other adults to experience grief and take different amounts of grief, different time periods for grieving according to their own personality and their own needs, rather than saying, oh, well, I only grieved a month, so you should only grieve a month?
Yeah. There's no grieving time limit. You know, I mean, now I think if 20 years later somebody has shut down life and not been able to function, but we get this idea. Men have a tendency to do this. It's like, let's just get over it and let's move to the next thing. Well, that's really not how life is. But I think men, you know, when scripture says that it's not right for man to be alone, a lot of people interpret that it's not right for men to be alone. And so they want to get over it quicker, and they'll be the ones to go out and buy the new dog and bring it home. And I think there just has to be a sensitivity that one child is going to process that in due time. I mean, they cut up their losses into doable doses. And so it may be a week or 2 weeks for one child. It may be a few months for another child. You know, I think I grieve the loss of my dog, and it seems kind of weird. I grieve the loss of my dog more than I grieve the loss of my mom. And somebody's probably going, well, that guy's weird. People grieve differently, and they don't grieve the same way, and they don't grieve, you know, in this habitual pattern that's the same for everybody. It's just different. And I think it's a person's heart trying to deal with loss in their life, because it means that something was valuable to them somewhere. And I think that's just going to happen over a period of time, and it just takes a little bit of patience. Instead of trying to tell somebody quit grieving, it's not doing that. It's engaging with them and exposing them to more. And it maybe go looking at other pets and that, but it's just saying it's going to take them time and not being afraid to talk about it.
Right. It's better to validate that person's feelings, whether they're positive or negative or a mixture of both, and just being willing to be present with them in the grief and not advise them or try to push them through it.
You know, we celebrate the day my dog died. I mean, we had the 2-year time. And so a group of people got together and they brought their dogs over, and we just sat around and talked about, you know, where do dogs end up anyway? You know, What about our animals? Okay, is this animal just as much? And it's fun to have that conversation because I think we're all used to having pets of some sort in some way, and there is a celebration of those that have left behind us. And I go, if we can celebrate people just as well, that would be wonderful. I think we have a tendency to forget about people quickly and move on. And I go, you know what? I've always wanted to keep in mind the people that have meant a lot to me and remember the impact and why God has put them in my life so that I can be better, so I can emulate what God would have me do, so I can grab a hold of that lesson that that he used this person in my life, this animal in my life, for a purpose, and I just become better for it.
Part of that healthy lament and that process of going through the grief is eventually coming to that place where you can honor the legacy that person has left behind in your life and in the lives of those around you. So that can be a concrete way to help children recognize the value of that person or animal in their lives.
Well, absolutely. And I think by having pictures of even if it's grandpa or a mom or a sister, we don't take them all down and move on. You keep them up and you talk about them. And I think there's something about that says I'm not afraid of that. I mean, I think the reason that God gave us animals and pets, they don't live as long as we do, except for tortoises and some of those. But he gives us the opportunity to see birth to death. And we get to experience that. And if we're lucky and blessed, we get to see that 4 or 5 times in our lifetime to prepare us for that time, knowing that this is how life will go for us as well. And so how we respond to the death of an animal is the same time. I'm talking about pets that you have in your home, that it's about the same way that we respond to the death of people around us. And I think there's just a part of saying it's okay to grieve and hurt, but it's also okay to not know everything. And we get this idea, especially in the Christian world, that we got to have an answer for everything. We don't. I mean, we serve a God that has the answers to everything. I don't have to know all the answers. I mean, there's a lot of things that I'm confused about. And if somebody gives me a tried answer, it just infuriates me a little bit. You're trying to answer something with something that doesn't mean anything. Maybe there is no answer to this. Maybe this is one of those secret things of God that Scripture talks about that we'll find out when we get to heaven. And I get the idea when I get to heaven that all 8 of my dogs that have died are going to run up to me, and I'm going to have a tough time figuring out which one do I pet first. And but we'll see. We'll see. I don't know.
Grief, because we can't understand why certain people are gone or pets are gone or what happens after this exactly. This is an opportunity for us to trust God in a way that we normally try to trust our own understanding. And so this can be an area of our lives that magnifies, are we really willing to trust God when we don't understand? And I think traumatic grief is an extra difficult place where we really are tested in our trust of God. Have you had to deal with kids and teens regarding traumatic complex grief issues? And complex grief, as a fellow counselor, you understand what that means, but just for anybody in the audience that doesn't know what that means, that would be something that's violent or something that is a suicide or a drug overdose or something along those lines. That's particularly hard for kids and for teens. How would we go about really working with kids through that kind of a grief?
You know what? The first thing is to make sure we're talking about it. I mean, I think that's the issue, and not ignoring it. I don't know. I couldn't. It's hard for me to tell you what to say to somebody else when they've had a sense of loss. I just spoke in Oklahoma City a couple of nights ago, and interestingly enough, 6 young ladies were killed in an accident. They rolled through a stop sign, high school girls, in Tishomingo, Oklahoma, and I can't even imagine the grief that school is feeling. But the girl who was driving just forgot to hit her brakes, and she rolled through a stop sign, was hit by a semi, and all girls were killed instantly. Well, what are you supposed to say to that? And my point of it is, I don't have the answer to that. I do know that those girls were special to a lot of people. And it's by talking it through and letting people process out loud and listening to the same thing over and over and over again and giving them opportunities to process out loud is so important. And just listening more than anything else, rather than coming up with, well, God knew this was going to happen. Well, they're in a better place. Well, and we give all these answers that just, I'm going, if you'll just stop and listen and be who you are rather than trying to do something. You don't have to say something spiritual. You're already spiritual. The presence of God is in you and is there. And if out of the abundance of your heart, something comes out, then it may be God moving you to say that, but he may be moving you to not say anything at all. And it's okay just to be there and not ignore the situation. I am so glad that I wasn't in that town and having to talk to the students at that high school or having to go to the funeral. I never want to participate in stuff like that. It's uncomfortable, but it's important for me to be there. And so that's where I will move into the uncomfortable to hopefully comfort somebody else in the process. And the end result of that is I still don't feel comfortable, but that's okay. God puts us into situations that he can use us even when we don't feel like we want to be there or have a discussion. All we have to do is show up, have a presence, and it's amazing how God will work through us in the wildest of ways beyond what we could ever imagine.
So I love you and I'm here for you, and ugly snot crying here with you is better than odd, odd advice and trying to give them some answers.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the fact that we feel like we have the answers, or when we say, I understand what you're going through, or I know what, we can do that in the loss of a pet, but not really, because nobody really understands how somebody else is really feeling. So all I can do is share that and I've been there and I feel sorry for you. And if there's anything that I can do, let me know. Tell me about your dog. Tell me about your cat. Tell me about your grandpa. Hey, tell me what you remember most about these 6 girls. What is it? What is the last memory you have of them? And that in a way is just opening the door for the process of grief to happen. And the end result of it is they'll get to a better place. Now, it doesn't mean that they'll accept the fact that this was a joyous event, or that they'll rest and go, oh, it's so wonderful they're in heaven. That's not the point. We jump to the end of the sentence way too quick when we need to be walking down that path with them and not feel like we just immediately need to get to the other side where we forget it and move on. Those young ladies that died in the accident will change the destiny of every one of those families and the destiny of Tishomingo, Oklahoma, for years and years and years to come. They will not be forgotten in the next 2 or 3 lifetimes. And I go, and that's okay. And it should be that way. It really should be that way.
Yes. Every person's life affects another, not to do anything trite, like a wonderful life. It's a wonderful life quote, but I think that's why that movie meant so much, is because it showed us that there's a hole when someone's missing. Yeah. And there's an even more painful hole when we know that they've been there and they're missing. Yeah. And I think that's just a thing that we need to honor in other people, is their pain, even though it's uncomfortable to honor someone's pain. That's what love does. Love does the uncomfortable response. I will sit with you. I will let my heart break for you, and I will remain in that sad place with you without trying to jerk you out of it too soon.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, perfect words. Perfect.
So thank you so much for coming on the show today, Mark. I want to make sure the audience can get a copy of Where's Stitch and follow your ministry with Heartlight Ministries. How can they stay connected with you?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, the book, they can get it wherestitch.com, or they can go on Amazon and pick it up anywhere, or Target, or anywhere around the country. I mean, everybody's carrying it. And so they can do it that way. They can find out about Heartlight and our residential counseling center at heartlightministries.org. Or they can listen to us on the radio at parentingtodaysteens.org or our podcast. I mean, there's a million different places out there. I've spent my life helping families and teens and doing anything we can to help them. And this book is just one. It's just taking an instance of a dog dying and saying there's a lot for us to learn, and it could help kids get to a better place.
I hope that all of you listening have enjoyed this conversation and really are looking forward to getting a copy of Where's Stitch, if not for your own children, for your children to be able to share with other kids that need to have a framework of story so that they can enter into these very difficult discussions with adults and start to feel like people are hearing their hearts when they're grieving. So take advantage of this opportunity to connect with Mark Gregston and his ministries and get a copy of Where's Stitch. And of course, I also hope that you come back for the next episode of Flourish-Meant. Flourish-Meant is part of the Spark Media Network and can be found on the Edify app.